Rupert, welcome to our office. We're having a book launch tonight, your new book, the second big book on the history of global warming and the global warming movement, the climate movement, the green movement. What is the reason you're so interested in the history and the philosophical roots of the environmental movement? Where does it come from?
It actually came from David Henderson, who, as you know, was the first chair of the Global Warming Policy Foundation's Academic Advisory Council. And sitting with him from over a number of times and having lunch with him, he kind of provoked me and needled me. And eventually I thought, I have to write a book about it. And the book that came out as a result of that was The Age of Global Warming. And it, in a way, it is the first to treat the phenomenon as in terms of historical experience. The second book is, the way I'd put it, its relation to the first is, this takes you up the dark side of the mountain. So this takes, the narrative is very much about continental Europe, the role of Sweden and the role of Germany.
Obviously, this book, Green Tyranny, goes back much further than your first book. It goes back essentially to the 19th century and the evolution, the origins of technophobia, Western fear of new technologies, of the idea of progress. Obviously, progress ideas were the dominant philosophy for much of the 19th century. Where do you see was the main change that tipped Europe into self-doubt and almost nihilistic skepticism about the future, about technology?
Well, that's very much the German side of the story. The Swedish part of the story, where it actually begins and where global warming actually begins, is very, very different. And part of the, if you like, the narrative, how it swings from the Swedish belief in progress, a very technocratic Swedish social democratic solution, which was build lots of nuclear power stations, yet we've ended up with wind and solar. And why is that? That is wholly because of Germany and what you described, the irrational fear of progress. This Germany, a country that was unified on blood and steel and the strength of its economy, yet rejects, there's a profound rejection of industrialization within German culture and harking back to the forest and so forth. But to take the Swedish angle first, it will come as a surprise to many people that the first politician of note to talk about global warming was not Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. It wasn't Helmut Kohl. It was actually the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1974. Now, why was that? Well, you dig around in Sweden, in what was happening in Sweden, and in fact, Sweden called the world's first environmental conference, which occurred in Stockholm in 1972. Why was Sweden so obsessed with the environment? Well, Sweden had launched the war on coal, if you like, with acid rain. Why was that happening? It was because Sweden decided they wanted to have the world's largest per capita nuclear power program, and nuclear power was not popular with a lot of ordinary Swedes. So the Social Democrats said, well, how do we persuade people to make nuclear power, get them to accept nuclear power? And the answer was, well, if you don't have nuclear power, you have coal. Now, Sweden has no coal itself. It has to import all of it. And so they said, well, we had to persuade people that coal is going to destroy our forests, it's going to turn our lakes acidic and so forth. So the first thing you saw was the acid rain scare. And that came out in the late 60s. Sweden was going on about acid rain. In the 1970s, the focus, they then launched with global warming. And you see the cast of characters involved in the in the politics of global warming, particularly Bert Berlin, who who became the first chair of the IPCC. He also happened to write the first governmental report on acid rain. So the impulse for all this comes from Sweden. The fact it turned into something very different, in fact, anti-nuclear power, is because of Germany. It's the German leg of the story.
And that goes much further back, because the greening of German politics started much earlier than after World War II. You looked at the history of environmental thinking in Germany. When do you see the first movements in that country where environmental issues become so prominent?
Well, you have you obviously have the whole notion of ecology, which comes in the 19th century, and you also have German scientists who who were against the Industrial Revolution and believed in renewable power and so forth, renewable energy, or basically energy from the sun, and that was at the beginning of the 20th century. But I think what's very interesting is during the Nazi period, because it happens to be the case that the Nazis were Europe's first Greens. And if you look at virtually everything that you see in the modern environmental movement, it is prefigured in that darkest chapter of European history. I think one really can't escape that fact. And whether it's, it happens to be the case, for example, that the Nazi Party was the first political party in the world to have a wind power program. That happens to be a fact. There's one thing Hitler said. He said, politics doesn't really interest me. What I want to do is change people's lifestyles. There's this whole thing, I don't need to nationalise industry, I'm interested in nationalising people. So, and you have this very, very, it's actually uncannily, preternaturally modern. And that's what I think makes the whole thing, when you look at it, so very, very frightening in a way, that this we've seen from the past the way something can go horribly, horribly bad and evil. And the word you use is nihilistic. In writing about this, it was the nihilism and the irrationalism that came to mind. And then you get that in the after 1945. Paradoxically, although I don't think it is a paradox, it's a paradox that can be explained. You see that on the New Left. And writing about the Frankfurt School, those same words came to what explains this phenomenon. It's actually, this is irrational, it's anti-human, it's nihilistic. And the thing about the New Left, and I have a chapter on the New Left and the Frankfurt School, they had this thing called critical theory, but they had nothing positive. It was just what was wrong with capitalism. It was the New Left is essentially a synthesis of Freud and Marx, and it developed this criticism of capitalism, and particularly of the working class, because the working class weren't doing what the Marxists said, which the Marxists said that the working class should be revolutionary. And they weren't doing that. So what had they been duped by capital? They had been duped by the artifacts of capitalism and materialism and kitsch culture, and they were therefore the saps of this. And therefore, it was also the New Left were profoundly hostile to working people. And again, you see this in modern day environmentalism. So you get this very curious sort of this very kind of wraparound of the Nazis of the pre-World War period and the New Left of the post-war period, and how they meet behind. And again, it's a very specifically German phenomenon.
Right. Now, obviously, capitalism or free market societies have been thriving despite the Marxist predictions that they would eventually collapse, that the economy would become so contradictory that it couldn't survive. So clearly capitalism turned out to be much more vibrant than the old left thought. But the idea that capitalism is actually at the root of the destruction of the planet makes capitalism look really evil. So is it essentially a stick with which to beat the same beast?
Yes, I think it is, and the way I put it in the book is that by the 1970s, Marxists in Germany on both sides of the Iron Curtain, West German Marxists, East German Marxists, came to the same conclusion that capitalism had won the economic game. Therefore, they had to change the rules of the game. So, and what were the rules of the game? They changed them. Well, actually, capitalism is destroying the planet. So you have these bizarre things, bizarre people who come up, well, actually, instead of the classic industrial sort of Marxist model, we ought to look at Mao and peasant cultures and so forth. And a lot of, out of this bubbled, if you look, the philosophy that animated the Green movement, which you know a lot about, which started in 1980. So yes, it was because capitalism had beaten socialism, so they decided they had to play a different game.
I mean, there was, as I recall from my own experience, because I obviously witnessed and was part of the shift from left to green, there was another huge advantage in that the green issue was immediately very popular among groups of people the left had never ever reached. Most people in Germany weren't really interested in the new left, in the radical left at all. But whenever there was a new plant or a nuclear power plant built or an airport expanded, there was local opposition, and the left could form an alliance with ordinary people for the first time. And once the Green Party was established, it was successful fairly quickly. So it was a very, very popular movement, not least because the media in the 70s was full of doomsday predictions. Think Limit of Growth report in 1972.
The other thing to bear in mind, and this you'll know very well, is that West German students were the most radicalised of any Western country. So there's an opinion poll in 1969 showing 30% of high school and university students saying they were favourable to Marxism or communism, much higher than any other country. So that's the kind of, if you like, the young people rejecting the tenets of capitalism and the free market, in fact, the bourgeois society. But there is this profound contradiction in German culture between its material success and what it's built on, and its philosophical or cultural reaction of what it thinks it ought to be and what it is. And this is something that Germany today has still not yet resolved, and it is irresolvable. But it is, I mean, the interesting thing to me is how we are now having to live with the consequences of Germany's inability to deal with itself.
Because at the core, it's not just a German issue. At the core is the issue that almost all Western societies live with this schizophrenic fear of technology, fear of economic growth, fear of capitalism, but they love it at the same time and they want it. You see, the Greens in Germany now are the top upper middle class voters. The wealthiest people in Germany vote Green. The Green Party is a party of the well-off. But they are the ones who preach less materialism. Yes. So there is this, and they go on holidays 4 or 5 times a year. And they fly. So this schizophrenic idea, on the one hand, you want to save the planet and you want less economic growth and less materials. On the other hand, you actually represent the most materialist part of the population. I still can't get around that.
Well, it's actually what we discuss, which I put in the book, which is that your solar PV panel is your absolution for your lifestyle, and it makes you money because you go down, you click the euros you've made from selling your expensive electricity to poorer households. I think the other thing to bear in mind with Germany in terms of its historical development in the 1980s is how the environmental movement became entwined with the peace movement and the anti-nuclear missile movement in the 1980s. And again, Germany was in the front line of this. The Pershings were there to defend for very good reasons to keep the Atlantic Alliance intact. It was actually Helmut Schmidt who wanted the Pershings there, Helmut Kohl who got them there. But the ecological movement, the environmental movement, very, very quickly became entwined with the peace movement. It became deeply penetrated by East Germany and by the Warsaw Bloc. So you had the famous Petra Kelly's lover, that ex-general, who turned out to be a Stasi agent. So you had enormous manipulation by the Kremlin and by the Stasi of what was happening, and of course it was undermining the West. I think there's a paradox as well, which is that the people who were on the wrong side of the Cold War turned out to be the winners in the post-Cold War period, and this is a very bitter draught for a lot of us to swallow, but I think that happens to be the case.
Yes. Now, how did it actually affect other Western countries, in particular the US? I mean, the US had an early environmental movement also in the early 70s, quite different, but Earth Day was 1970, the first Earth Day, something like very early 70s. So there was a different tradition, of course, and there was the Vietnam War, which also raised some environmental issues. But a different trajectory. But whereas today you don't see these national differences that
well,
strong.
if you as I sort of write in The Age of Global Warming, the single most important book, I would argue, of the post-war period is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. What was that about? It wasn't about wind and solar, or indeed energy is not even mentioned there. It was about chemicals. It was principally about DDT. Now, getting rid of DDT had virtually no impact on an American's lifestyle. It has been terrible for people living in Africa and the malaria and so forth. But for Americans, it involved very limited, no changes in lifestyle. It was the Europeans that focused on energy. First of all, I say with the Swedes, but particularly the renewables stuff really comes out of Germany. Of course, it got rapidly adopted in the US, and there is a strain of environmentalism also heavily influenced by European thinkers. I mean, remember the Frankfurt School was in the US for quite some time and had a huge impact on American universities. And there are other sort of German things like Fritz Schumacher. Again, he was an opponent of the Nazis. Yet, nonetheless, coming to the same view of renewables.
Now, some people have compared the Green movement, the Green philosophy, to a religion, and obviously the collapse of communism and the disintegration of Christianity in much of the Western world, particularly in Europe, has opened a gap, a real gap for some kind of salvationist ideology. Do you really think that the green idea, the green philosophy is filling that gap? Is it actually providing people with some kind of philosophy that can replace the faith, whether it's the faith in Christianity or the faith in progress that most Europeans have completely lost?
Partly, I suppose, but I think it's more ideology than theology, but with a caveat that perhaps the caveat doesn't even apply, that there's a lot of guilt there. So instead of the guilt of feeling I'm rich and there are poor people, it's I'm consuming lots of resources, but I can do these things and it absolves me from the harm I'm doing the planet. So the guilt may have been transferred, but guilt is never a good rationale for policy. So yes, I think it has filled certainly an ideological vacuum with the collapse of socialism. What it in particular it does, though, is it's what I call in the book, it's ethics for the wealthy. It gives you the particularly if you're in part of the climate industrial complex, you can get very rich and I'm doing good, I'm saving the planet. That's a great place to be.
Yeah. Now, in your book, you talk about the intolerance of the movement, the intolerance towards critics, skeptics. Where does that come from? Why are the Greens, who are so successful, and the movement that has really conquered the world, why are they so afraid of the small group of critics who obviously show the weaknesses of their ideology and their politics?
Because I think fundamentally there is a totalitarian impulse in it, and that this ideology demands that people agree with it, and if they disagree with it, they should not speak out. And in that sense, it shares characteristics with the ideologies of the former communist bloc, and that's the conclusion. As you write, you kind of conclusions form in your mind, and this hostility to free speech and free expression, the delegitimization of debate, the marginalization of people who disagree, it has a totalitarian impulse in it.
But if you want to save the planet, and if the threat to the existential threat to our society is that severe, then anyone who questions that alarmism is a threat to the very survival of humankind.
That's correct. But it needs, I think there's something, I think that also reflects its paranoia, the paranoia of the ideology, that actually it's not strong enough to withstand criticism. And you see that with, I mean, clearly where the ideology is weakest is the economics of wind and solar, which are absolutely terrible. I mean, they are beyond terrible. To give you an example, the German Green Minister, when he first, Jürgen Trittin, when he sort of launched the German Energiewende, said it's going to be the equivalent of a scoop of ice cream on monthly energy bills. That scoop of ice cream has turned out for Germany to be up to 1 trillion euros. It's the most expensive scoop of ice cream the world's ever seen. So the paranoia, if you like, or the reflects the weakness of the ideology or the claims. Because the economics of renewable energy are catastrophically bad.
And also, while they have been very successful at the political level and at government level, the vast majority of people still are not really that bothered with green issues. Well, all the surveys we've seen over the years in almost every country, environmental issues are right at the bottom of people's concerns. So there is this disconnect that the political elite around the world is using it for tax and policy purposes, but the vast majority of the population really isn't that bothered.
So what you see is they have to shift from environmental and saving the planet to public health. So it's all about if that they invent these phony epidemiological studies on what CO2 and other will do to people's health. So the justification is actually, and funnily enough, one could see that with acid rain. The environmental thing, the environmental rationale has actually disappeared. It's all now about public health and air quality. So you see, if you want to win people over you say it's about the air we breathe. It's about the health of our grandkids. It's actually not about saving the planet.
Yes. Which is ironic, given that we've never been in better health as a society than ever before. I mean, life expectancy is still rising. And people dying from environmental or weather-related events have declined by more than 90%. So it's ironic to make it a health issue when the actual health data show in the opposite direction.
I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. We don't see people just lying in the streets gasping for breath from urban air quality.
Compared to 50 years ago.
Compared to the smogs. I mean, it's unbelievably absurd, but it is swallowed. So we see it here with when Michael Gove is banning the internal combustion sales of new cars with internal combustion engines.
I know this is about the history and the evolution of the climate industrial complex, as you call it. But where do you think, has it peaked? Have we seen the peak of the movement? Do you think that reality, there will be a mugging of reality, that governments will actually begin to realize the policies are becoming more unpopular, are becoming economically harmful. Do you see that, or do you think there's still some way to go?
I think rich societies will throw a lot of money at the problem before there is reality hits. But we're beginning to see that change. I think the really interesting place at the moment is Australia in that regard, and South Australia with the blackouts last year, and where in South Australia, which has the highest level of renewables, it also has the highest electricity prices. You see that in the spread of fuel poverty. In Germany, you see, I think that the rise of the AfD in Germany reflects that. And of course, in the United States, I think the war on coal is one of the big reasons why Hillary Clinton is not in the White House. And there is a big problem for the parties of the left when this all hits, which is they have been bought by multi-billionaire environmentalists, and yet the parties of the left are meant to be the voice of working people, and they have completely lost that. You cannot reconcile those two. And this is the big... When parties of the right... What?
But are the parties of the left really still the parties of the working?
No, they've lost
people?
that.
Because
they've lost
they say
that.
these are all racist, these are the deplorables. We are now the party of the middle class.
Well, that's the reason I think why the SPD is in an existential crisis in Germany. But it's also I think it's the reason why Trump, despite all the problems and whatever he may have, why the real political problem is for the Democrats, because it's impossible to reconcile their historical mission of being the voice of working people with the environmental, we've got to have more, we've got to save the planet, we're going to make electricity vastly more expensive and so forth. It is impossible to reconcile that. And so the crisis, you'll see, if parties on the right have any intelligence at all, they will exploit that. And of course, in Britain, we see that they have no intelligence in this regard. But they will learn. I mean, politics, the political market eventually will clear. And so I think that will be the mechanism by which this thing comes to an end.
Rupert, many thanks. Good luck with the book launch tonight. And good luck with your new book.
Thank you very much.
Which I can highly recommend. It's called Green Tyranny: Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate Industrial Complex, and is freely available on Amazon.
It's available on Amazon.
Freely, did I say freely? It's available on Amazon.